My name is Bobby. I'll be your chair for this round. On government, we have NLSIU1. On opposition, we have IIUM1. Under the motion that this House lead the public figures serving in the Japanese government have a moral obligation not to visit the Yasukuni Shrine, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here.
Mr. Speaker, we believe that the Yasukuni Shrine in Japan stands for a perverse kind of fighting wars, where war criminals are commemorated. And we think there are many reasons why the current leaders of Japan should not be honoring these people. First, we need to understand the special significance that the Yasukuni Shrine holds in the world's collective memory today. Because what we do need to understand is that the Yasukuni Shrine is famous as a place where war criminals who participated in Japan's invasion of countries like Korea and China are interred. We think that these are places where these war criminals are commemorated when you do visit these places. And the reason why they're considered as war criminals are for pretty brutal atrocities that they committed, right? And this does not necessarily relate only to the war strategy that they adopted, but also the incidental violation of people's rights that they are most famous for. For instance, we think that things such as the rape of Nanking or the use of sex slaves on the front lines by the Japanese army, all of which are widely settled to be the sort of war crimes that were committed by the Japanese troops at that point of time, are the sort of memories that are associated with these particular war criminals. When you have commemorated them in this particular shrine, we need to recognize that the message you sent across when you visit is indeed to celebrate their memory. And secondly, we also need to understand that the shrine itself, which also comes with a museum attached, by the way, is also an attempt to try and distort the correct version of history. Because what the museum attached to the shrine tells you essentially is that all of these war crimes that were perpetrated by Japan were justified attempts at freeing Asia from some sort of imperialism that had taken over it. Which is why the shrine stands as a symbol of trying to justify the use of sex slaves or the rampant atrocities committed against civilians on the front lines as honorable military acts that were committed by the Japanese army in the objective of freeing Asia from imperialism. This then is the sort of symbol that the Yasukuni Shrine stands for today. The problem, however, is also that these are public figures, and we need to understand the specific context of public figures visiting these shrines, right? Because we understand that even if there are some people within Japanese society who may think that it is okay to commemorate these war criminals, when a public figure goes out there and visits, he's speaking on behalf of all of Japan. We think that the message being sent across to everyone else is that he is depicting certain values that all of Japanese people believe in. And we think that there is a specific moral obligation to not send across such a perverted view on behalf of the entire Japanese population when you're in a capacity where you represent them. But moving on, let's talk about what are the specific sort of moral obligations that are cast upon you. First of all, Mr. Speaker, we think that there is an obligation on you to ensure that attempts to whitewash history are not supported. The Yasukuni Shrine is an attempt to commemorate what is widely acknowledged to be a sense of war crime. We think that the more you allow it to be celebrated as an act, the more it becomes likelier to be repeated. Because the sort of deterrent that acted against people honoring the people who committed that is now being taken away when respectable public figures go out there and visit the shrine. We think that the risk of regression to such similar activities increases in such case, and we think that the leaders have an obligation towards humanity to ensure that such sort of atrocities never happen in the future. Secondly, we think that they have an obligation to correct the misinformation that they would spread by visiting the Yasukuni Shrine. This is because we think it becomes a lot easier for people to simply ignore their history or rather misinterpret their history to serve their own needs when they see that leaders are also going to the shrine which commemorates the leader, which commemorates these war criminals. We think that they should have the responsibility of letting history speak of the actual facts that happened on the ground, rather than lending support to alternative narratives that reduces the importance that we currently give to the sort of war crimes that were perpetrated by these people. The focus should indeed remain upon the sort of atrocities that were committed by Japan in the past, because we think that the people have a right to know that, and the people should be able to learn from those in the future. But thirdly, we also think that this is simply a moral obligation of respecting the victims of the war crimes that were committed in the past. Because the moment you go and celebrate the people who unleashed these brutal atrocities, you're essentially conveying the message that you no longer respect the rights of the victims who suffered under them. We think that the larger interest of justice requires that Japan stands up and takes up its responsibility and acknowledge that in the past it did perpetrate these devilish crimes against people. And we do see that countries have done this in the past, right? For example, in Nazi Germany, what we saw was that after the fall of the regime, Germany stood up and took responsibility for the actions that it did unleash upon people. It did not celebrate the same by visiting memorials that were depicted to honoring the memory of the war criminals. It openly and publicly condemned the sort of people who had unleashed these war crimes and made sure that it had a clean break from the sort of history that had come to dominate it until that point of time. We think, therefore, in the interest of honoring the victims who suffered under this model also, it's particularly important to do that. But before I move on, yes?
If your purpose is to teach the correct version of history, why don't you directly do that to the education system rather than saying that, oh, this might be an indirect misinterpretation that people might take and therefore we shouldn't go there?
Perfect. We'll do that. We'll go and put it explicitly in the textbooks, saying that this is the sort of atrocities we unleash and why we think it's wrong. We have no problem with using all and any means possible at our hands to convey that message. But the problem is, if you put it in the textbooks and simultaneously you go to a shrine that commemorates that, there is a distortion of messages, right? Because on the one hand, you're saying it's wrong. On the other hand, you're going and celebrating the same people you're trying to criticize through other sources. And that's the sort of conflicting message that we do not want you to perpetrate. Finally, we think that it's no real excuse for the leaders to say that at least some of the members of the public are okay with this idea. Because first of all, let's look at this, right? We think that there may be many reasons why the public may have reasons to think that it's a good idea to honor these war criminals. Maybe because of a rising sense of nationalism, or because there is simply some amount of misinformation that exists about the actual events that happened at that day. But when you are a leader of the people, we think that it is your responsibility to correct the wrong views that the people may hold up in society, rather than use that as justifications. Simply because what you do, rather than what the ordinary citizen does, gets interpreted as a message sent on behalf of the entire population of Japan. And we don't think you should be doing something as irresponsible and as morally reprehensible as honoring war criminals when you hold this representative capacity. For all these reasons, we think it's particularly important that the Japanese leaders boycott this particular shrine and don't commemorate their war criminals.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech. To open the case of the opposition, I'd like to welcome the leader of all. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, it hurts me to hear people homogenizing everybody that is memorized in the idea of the Yasukuni Shrine.
Yeah.
Because let's bear in mind that the Yasukuni Shrine aren't just made out of people who are war criminals. We think that PM was extremely insensitive in characterizing these people. That's why in my speech, I'll tell you two things. Number one, why people have a right to visit the dead, even in this scenario. And number two, why is it necessary to allow visits from public officials, especially them, right? Before that, several rebuttals. I have three to be exact. Number one is, what exactly does the Yasukuni Shrine stand for? We don't think that the Yasukuni Shrine only stands for war criminals, because if you if you take into context as to what happened back then in World War II, probably the people who were at fault were the people giving out the orders. There were also people like soldiers who were merely following the orders because they had no other choices in their lives, right? They were coerced into doing so. I'll further characterize to you about this in my substantive. But generally, the Yasukuni Shrine is a general shrine whereby you have the generals being memorized, and you also have people who were innocent. Basically, there is no different segregation creating a fence around the names, like these are the people people that we acknowledge are guilty, these are the people that we acknowledge are innocent. Basically, what you do is you paint everybody with one brush, and we think that's simply a complete form of injustice, considering the fact that you also did not want to fight for the blaming of innocent people. We don't think that it's fair for you to just homogenize and call everybody a war criminal. This is extremely offensive. But secondly, right, he told us that this is bad because history will then repeat itself, the point at which people go. That's ridiculous, right? People don't go and then suddenly see the names and go, okay, I want to repeat World War II. Are you crazy? There are so many reasons why people won't think that this is something that is acceptable or we will do it again. First off is, I don't know, maybe the verdict that came out from the Tokyo tribunal that already were willing to verdict and convict the individuals who are guilty. Number two is considering the fact we have new human rights laws that already outline what we can and cannot do, and there are repercussions to it. The fact that Japan has so many ties with more diplomatic and democratic countries that are more inclined to becoming more human rights compliant. The fact that people on the ground have more media exposure in comparison to 1945, where they only had to remember and listen to the idea of their emperors who probably indoctrinated them into believing extreme nationalistic ideas. People aren't that vulnerable anymore. We don't think history will repeat itself, considering the fact that we're very explicit of the regret that we have of their actions. No. Then he told us the rights of the victims. Now it's as if we're not giving the victim any closure and we're just saying, suck it up. That's not how it works. We're not telling the victims to suck it up, considering the fact that we've given them apologies. There's court verdicts to say that the people who have wronged you are guilty. The fact that we're okay with the idea of paying these people compensation if it is proven that you are victimized due to several people's actions. The state does not endorse past war criminals, right? The same example can be seen as how even in the whole Nazi Jew situation, right? We don't stop people visiting the Nazi graves, even though we acknowledge what the Nazi did is wrong. Generally, because we acknowledge this doesn't mean we don't, protect the victims. No. Several premises that opposition wants to talk about, right? Before going to substantive, we are okay with the state acknowledging the mistake of World War II, whereby generals were giving extreme orders that violated human rights laws. We will apologize. We will pay compensation. We are okay with teaching history that entails the idea what we did was wrong as well. We are okay with the idea of people going there by choice, meaning that they have no moral obligation to go or not go. Furthermore, we also think that you can go to these memorials for whatever reason that you have, whether it's for your own perspective, educational purposes, or to regret the sort of war that already occurred. No. Why people have a right to visit the dip? We have to understand the dynamics that existed within the Japanese army in World War II, because we think that's extremely crucial for this debate. First off is that many of the soldiers that were under the premises of the Japanese government was the fact that they were continuously brainwashed into believing that what they did was wrong, right? Especially considering the individuals that was not found guilty under the Tokyo tribunal. In 1945, where they had no media, no forms of check and balances to realize what they did was wrong, the only form of exposure and media they had was by the state. That was not democratic at all. They were under the belief that Emperor Meiji was God. That when Emperor Meiji told them that this is what we needed to do to show that this is the correct form of governance and that we are the right ones, all of these soldiers did was that they followed it out through, right? Moreover, they were also conscripted into the army. The fact that the choices that they were given was a Hobson choice, right? It's either you join or you die. I would like to think that's not a validated choice that an individual has to go through. Emperor Meiji mandated Order 122 that said, if you don't join, you will die. Tell me you will choose to die in that situation where you had no means of verifying that, not wanting to join this army would be the right thing to do. These people did not know what was going on, right? We don't think that it's fair to punish them, given the fact that even courts didn't find them guilty. Why should we homogenize everyone as war criminals? Moreover, there was continuous societal dismissal. There was continuous societal expectation from society saying that if you don't join the army, given the conscription and the mandate of the state, you're seen as a traitor. Families, wives, children all said, Dad, if you don't go, you're not defending us and you're not defending our country. These individuals basically had no means of going, saying, no, we don't think this is something we want to acknowledge within status quo. Therefore, we think it's perfectly fine for us to pay respect to these individuals that are there. The point at which you tell public officials they have a moral obligation to not go means you're also creating a barrier for us to be able to pay respect to these other people who may not necessarily be guilty. But even if they're guilty, we think that our side of the house allows people to learn the nuances, right, of the war. Before that, yes.
When we say that Nazi Germany committed immoral acts, do we mean to say that only Hitler did these acts, or that brainwashed people who were also following Hitler's orders also committed these immoral atrocities?
Look, obviously Hitler was wrong, but if Hitler was buried in a graveyard where other people were as well, whether it's guilty or not, we're not going to step everyone for going to that graveyard and being able to appreciate and pay respects to the dead and homogenize everyone in that graveyard as being Hitler, right? Because essentially that's what you're doing. When you learn the nuances, given the fact that there are also guilty people, that means that you can appreciate and even regret the war that has also happened. That means it's more educational. People don't just go there with sombrero hats and like party poppers saying that, hey, yeah, we're happy and celebrating what we did. People cry, considering the fact that this was something that our people were forced into doing, and the fact that there was a point in time some of these people thought it was right to do such acts because they were coerced and given the environment into believing so, and we think that is an extreme misrepresentation. Why is it necessary to allow public officials to go? It's because that's when you legitimize the difference of blame, right? That's when you allow public officials to make a sign saying that not everybody is entirely guilty. We shouldn't homogenize people. We should be able to pay respects. Some of the public officials were probably related to those people who were in World War II and died. Why is it wrong for you to pay respect, not for the action, but for the circumstances they were in, by virtue of those people being people? We don't think that, you know, when a child faces the idea that her mother may have been a murderous human being, that suddenly that child has no means of visiting that mother and just paying respect for the life that that mother probably led way before all of this happened. We think your side of the house paints everybody with one single brush. That's not fair. We should acknowledge the nuances and what respect and education really means for the Japanese people. Thank you.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for the speech. To continue with the case of government, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
You need this. This is your sheet.
Yeah, thanks.
This is not your sheet.
This will be it.
So Speaker, let's first engage with the idea that the Japanese shrine in fact commemorates war veterans, genuinely innocent people who sacrifice their lives for the good of Japan, and does not in fact commemorate war criminals. We tell you that this sort of characterization, packed with a lot of outrage, has ignored a lot of things that Prime Minister has already told you in his speech. That this Yasukuni shrine is not just a monument with people's names written on it, it comes accompanied with a museum that does so much to actually hide the history of Japanese atrocities during World War II. We think this sort of message is incredibly problematic because this means that the Yasukuni shrine, though it ostensibly has a lot of people who are merely war veterans, has taken on a meaning and symbol that associates it with atrocities and war crimes, and by going there, you do endorse it. Let's understand the distinction, right? We say that you cannot go to Auschwitz and pretend that you're going there because you want to commemorate Nazi organizational efficiency. Auschwitz has come to be associated with the Holocaust, with concentration camps, with the murder of Jews, and you cannot ignore the sort of meaning you convey by going to such a place. We say that the sort of characterization on their part is incredibly irresponsible. Second, let's assume for a second that a vast majority of people were not responsible because they were simply obeying command responsibility. Let's understand the nature of Japan at the time we were talking about, right? We say that it is not easy for one person who believes in incredibly radical views to suddenly come to power and to perpetrate these views on a mass of other people. For this, we need to understand exactly how Japan functioned and what Japan did. The rape and pillaging of multiple cities, right? The use of comfort women and sex slaves on the front lines of war. Or, for instance, the imposition of Japanese culture by the brutal use of force. We say that these are not the actions of one man or a few officials up top. These happen by taking together public sentiment and by making people believe that this sort of action is legitimate. If it were true, Mr. Speaker, that thousands of men stood watching as 12 war criminals forced themselves on South Korean women, we say that their justification would be correct. But when a mass of South Korean women are raped, and to this day remember this with horror, we say everyone was equally culpable. As an unwilling bystander perhaps, but a bystander who was willing to rape the next day or the day after that, and a bystander who endorsed this sort of nationalist sentiment in the name of Japan, they do deserve to be condemned for that. Sit down. We say that the next thing that you need to take into account is an idea that even if you are given a certain command, we believe on our side of the house that after the war is over, it's extremely important to send out the message that it is not important. It is important to rebel against those commands. What is that? Because we believe that we need to send out that message which creates a better world for human rights and a better culture for humanitarian justice. What would that culture be? The culture which tells you that you can obey someone who tells you that you can rape anyone and simply because you're a part of the military, or a culture which tells you that the moment someone gives you such a command, all of you together must rebel against that person. We say that the latter message is a better message to send, that soldiers should be told not to obey unreasonable commands, and therefore our side of the house is in fact protecting the greater moral obligation. Listening to someone who asks you to rape is not enough of a justification for rape, and it's okay for a stance, especially right now, to take this sort of moral absolutism. The second thing that they tell you is this, right? They tell you that it's okay for people to visit the shrine, but it's and therefore it must also be okay for public officials to visit the shrine, ignoring a lot of arguments that we've already given you. Why? We say ostensibly it is perhaps possible to believe the idea that the person who actually raped and pillaged someone was your father, and you want to visit him for personal reasons. Unfortunately, when you visit as a public official, you're not visiting your father, you're visiting as a representative of a nation, taking a position on what is morally correct. You're not only painting the views of that one person whose father he was, you're painting the views of an immense number of people who do not believe in what you're saying. And this is especially true of Japan, where in fact people endorse a pacifist constitution. There may be a small minority that wants a revisionist history. But you are taking a stand on behalf of all of them, and that is unjustified. And it's not mitigated by the effect of this emotional intimacy that you may have with this person that may propel you to forgive him, because now you are viewing him as a soldier, as a war criminal, and it's completely unendorsable for you to take a position where you say that you can ignore all that he has done simply because you think he may be someone's dad. But what we tell you are different prongs of moral history that they've simply ignored on their side of the house, right? We told you that the moral worth, the signal we want to send on our side is that the moral worth of different people is equal regardless of the nationality they come from. Which means that on our side of the house, just because someone died in a war for Japan, we don't want to privilege him over someone else, though he committed moral atrocities. Because to us, and in our heads, the moral worth of the South Korean woman who suffered, or the Chinese woman who suffered, or the Chinese man who suffered, is equal. We say this is a better message to send as a public official. Secondly, we told you that there is an obligation on us to correct misinformation. We told you that nationalist sentiments often get whipped up in public simply because the people may not be aware of everything that is told to them, or they may not be aware of the correct facts of history. But when you have thousands of classified files and thousands of history books sitting in a state library, you as a public official cannot ignore this sort of misinformation. It is your obligation as a person in a position of trust to correct that sort of misinformation and to bring the truth out into the public. We think this is a natural corollary of the public's right to know and the public's right to information.
Ma'am, people in the Yasukuni Shrine are also people who were not convicted by the Tokyo Tribunal because they were considered innocent. Are you regretting the Tokyo Tribunal's verdict?
Of course not. What we tell you is this. We tell you that we already told you how moral culpability can arise by believing in a certain sentiment or being a part of a certain regime and actively endorsing its acts, something they haven't understood, so it formed 3 minutes of my speech. Second, we tell you that evidence of mass rape and mass pillage is not often easy to pin onto individual people, and you need to understand how tribunals and war attribution efforts work. So that is not the message we're trying to say. And we also say that because the Japanese Yasukuni Shrine has acquired a symbol that associates it with one class over the other, that is again a good reason to boycott it, if that clears all your confusion. The idea of regression is the next substantive. They told you that it's okay to commemorate war criminals because somehow no one will regress back into World War II because of the Geneva Convention. Around the world today, we see human rights abuses happening with as much impunity as they happened during World War II, though tokenism has changed, right? However, we tell you that it's so easy to slip into that sort of attitude, especially in the high conflict situation you're in now. China hates you, you're on the brink of a possible war. South Korea is not too fond of you, he's looking for peace. When you actively stoke these sort of ultra-nationalist sentiments, let's for a second imagine the reaction of the Japanese people when this tension actually escalates into a high conflict area. We say that it makes people more likely to be aggressive and ruthless, and that is something we think you have a moral obligation to prevent. For all of these reasons, we are very proud.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the speech. To continue with the case of the opposition, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Parliament. Here.
It is odd that government brought the example of the Auschwitz camp. When I visited it, I saw public officials there who visited crying, regretting the mistakes which were committed by past leaders. At the same time, there were also people there, ladies and gentlemen, who wanted to learn from the lessons and the mistakes which were committed by leaders back then. There are multifaceted reasons to why individuals choose to attend a particular function or choose to commemorate a particular stone. This side only wanted to deal with the extreme scenario when individuals only choose to commemorate a selective few of generals who choose to perpetuate the war crimes back then. We think we need to be diverse. Side opposition provides that. I'm going to look at a couple of questions. My argumentation will revolve around why the function of the shrine in the 21st century has evolved. I'm going to show the case analysis upon the Tokyo governor and how he acted at the shrine recently. But before that, let's look on the characterization of the shrine. There are so many characterizations. The government told us that this shrine is there to primarily commemorate war criminals. What did we posit? We posited that the function of the shrine is a general shrine. There's not like where these are the names of the generals, these are the names of the innocent people. No, it's a general shrine, which means that our ability to decipher whether that person is a culpable person or is not is very dubious, ladies and gentlemen. What does this mean? How do we then differentiate the person who's a criminal and the person who's not? The most objective way for us to do so is through a trial. And that's where the Tokyo Tribunal comes to the picture, where thousands of people were convicted, ladies and gentlemen, thus differentiating a person who's guilty and a person who's not. Their response then, oh, but it's different. You might not be physically guilty, but you are morally culpable. I'm so freaking offended. If my father was forced into that war, knowing that he will be killed because there's a policy of conscription by Order 112, he is not morally culpable. If my father was brainwashed on a continuous basis, like how the North Koreans believe that Kim Jong-un is a god, how back then they believed that Emperor Meiji was tied to the sun god. That's why his picture was always affiliated behind the sun, ladies and gentlemen. We think that necessarily indicates that the person is not morally culpable because that person's definition of morality is defined by the state and the generals who exploited those people over and over again. When even in the West, if you want to go to war, the wife will say, please don't go, and you should be safe. In Japan, it's a different scenario. You should go to war. If you don't go to war, you are shame to me. You're not defending my dignity. You should go to war. You are not morally culpable because the definition of morality is not up to you. It is set by the state. I'm extremely offended. Sit down. Next, they say, oh, but never mind. Even if you are morally culpable, the purpose is you need to send a message. You need to send a message that you should fight against your leaders. You can do it now. Because the circumstances in Japan is obviously different. Media scrutiny is there. Accountable structures is there. Emperor Meiji is dead. We do not have the policy of conscription. But it doesn't mean you should forget the dead. You should ignore history when history itself should be there to at least for us to understand what the dead has gone through. The dead deserves their story to be told over and over again in contrast to your policy where you simply ignore them because you think that this simple benevolent messaging means that you will trump the rights of the dead who have been tortured, who have been forced in that war. We think that is a shame. Next, we also told you that there are individuals who visit these shrines because their family members are there and do suffer from that war. Their response was, but guys, these are public officials. Therefore, the characterization is different. Sit down. Firstly, we already told you that that argument is contingent on you proving that public officials are there to commemorate war criminals. But since we already bring up, at least we watered down that definition, that means public officials also have the right to visit the dead, right? It doesn't mean that just because you're a public official, suddenly you are enslaved to the job till a point that you cannot even visit your father, your grandfather, or individuals who have died. But even if these individuals are not your fathers, your grandfathers, these are your former military men who have died, your former national men who have died. You have a legitimate reason to visit it. But we will challenge the worst case scenario. If I am, even if I'm a public official under status quo, it is legitimate for me to visit my murderous wife, my murderous husband, or my murderous brother and sister. It does not matter. Because even if I choose to visit, the purpose is not to sit down, it's not to commemorate the actions of the individual, it's to commemorate the personhood, the life of a human being. You shouldn't undignify a person's life just because of that action. We think, ladies and gentlemen, an individual can divorce the action and the reason why he committed that action. You need to also see that as well. Then they said, oh, but guys, there's a museum state over there, and the museum legitimizes the war. I hate this, right? I went to Japan. This is just freaking lie. Number one, there's no freaking museum over there. We have a fact sheet there. Why is it true? what is the Yasukuni Shrine? You have the picture of that when Justin Bieber went there, right? There are 3 pillars which state, right, the Japanese term, which translated into in respect of the dead. You are distorting the messages by merely saying, presuming that it is dead. But even if it's written off that this war is legitimate, that context is premised upon the culture of subservience which Emperor Meiji created. That means it doesn't mean that people at the bottom who were forced to follow were equally guilty as well. How do I then conclude this argumentation, ladies and gentlemen? Even if we accept that there are some war criminals who were not convicted who were there, it is illegitimate for you to homogenize every single Japanese soldier to be a person who's guilty. Even if they stand in the minority, they deserve the right to be represented, for their stories to be heard, to at least have a graveyard where people can mourn upon. Even if they're guilty, people can divorce their actions in contrast when they choose to prey on their personhood. Yes.
When Prime Minister Abe goes to the Yasukuni Shrine, what do you think the average person sees it as? A commemoration of war criminals for which the shrine is famous, or as a commemoration of the ordinary veterans?
You do realize when like Abe and also the Tokyo governor went there, he also made a public apology acknowledging the mistakes of the Japanese government should make back then. He apologized to his victims in Japan, where the past governments forced them to enter. That's just a false characterization. On my argumentation, you should also engage the rebuttal from this side, on that, oh, now there will be a recommission of the same mistake. Matt already told you that it's not. They say, oh, but war still happened. So that it clearly shows that there's a mistake. War still happened for a lot of other reasons. It's not because of 3 stones which exist in the Yasukuni Shrine. But Japan in particular, because the shrine symbolizes the mistakes which they have gone through back then, symbolizes the failure which led to Japan losing World War II, means that this becomes a symbolic shrine for governments to remember not to repeat the same conscription tactics, the same coercive tactics, the same massacring tactics which they did. Because why would they want to go to war through that shrine which led them to lose the war to begin with? That's quite ridiculous, right? If that shrine does bring a particular value, that value is for us to not commit the same mistake, the same atrocities. We think that symbolic gesture which it brings is necessarily a good thing. For all these reasons, I'm very happy to oppose.
I think the deputy leader focuses for the speech, and now let's welcome the government whip.
Mr. Speaker, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, erstwhile Nazi Germany, now current democratic Germany, took several steps to ensure that it rehabilitated both the people that suffered from atrocities, in addition to ensuring that its image, both domestically and internationally, was rehabilitated. What did it do? Right? It first, of course, went across doing everything the opposition told you, and we agree with. It educated people about the atrocities. It told them that it was wrong. It prosecuted everyone it was supposed to. For example, the Nuremberg trials. In addition, however, what Nazi Germany did particularly well is that it tread with extreme caution in terms of how it reacted to its past and how it reacted to perceived celebration of its past. And what did it do here? Now I'll talk about the characterization of Auschwitz that we've already given you and that was responded to by Saeed on that side. When people go to Auschwitz, and indeed they're right, they do, but my second speaker already told you this. When they're going to Auschwitz, they see shrines that mourn the victims. They don't shriek graves of Himmler and Goering, and of course 10,000 other German soldiers to keep it fair. They don't, for example, therefore see a remnant of the regime itself. They mourn the victims of the regime. At no point does erstwhile Nazi Germany have shrines to the people who perpetrated these atrocities. And why is this? It's because Germany now recognizes that if you create any signals that even indicate that we are attached to our past, or or that we like certain elements of our past that perpetrated these atrocities, that's hugely problematic in terms of overall rehabilitation, and it's also extremely unfair on a moral scale. We think Japan did something similar for many years. So when the shrine was built in 1978, Japanese emperors and leaders studiously ignored that shrine and did not go to it. They didn't send public signals that could in any way suggest that they commemorate the shrine. The issue only arose now when Abe suddenly decided to go to the shrine and start doing things with it. We think, therefore, it's hugely problematic that this has begun now, and I'll come into my two clashes and tell you why it is. The first clash is on moral responsibility. Now, of course, they've contested us on facts in terms of what the shrine is. I'm extremely happy, therefore, that I have an article from the Times from December 2013, and let me quote. At a war museum on the grounds of the shrine, Japan's invasions of Korea and China are described as justified attempts to free Asia from imperialism. There is no mention about the rape of Nanking or about the military's use of frontline sex slaves. These are facts, Mr. Speaker, and not interpretation of facts by a newspaper. As a result of which, if they seek to contest us on facts that have been reported on the presence of a museum in the shrine connected to this shrine, which automatically whitewashes bad parts of Japan's history by saying these things probably didn't happen because they didn't mention it. In addition, there's a specific map which shows growing US imperialism in the region, and it says, therefore, that Japan's invasion of China and other regions in the area was a legitimate response to rising Western imperialism in the region. It clearly has very, very huge problems. We agree that war criminals aren't the only people buried there. However, clearly, again, war criminals and the war crime element of the shrine is what defines the shrine in the public domain, and it's extremely important to remember that. Their response to this, under moral responsibility, is, oh, well, we followed orders. We were under a certain amount of compulsion to do this, and therefore we are morally culpable. Remember, therefore, that if that's the case, you still remember that if the orders were bad, you have a moral obligation to not legitimize that stance in any way, which means that you must take a stance that it was extremely heinous. We understand it might be hard for people. We understand it might be hard for someone whose father may or may not have directly contributed to the rape of Nanking or directly had a personal sex slave from South Korea in the front lines, and therefore they wish to go back and celebrate their father. We know it's hard, and we know it's a sensitive issue. It's precisely because it's a sensitive issue that public officials in particular must tread with caution in this regard. Because we understand that if the incident defines this shrine, and if that shrine defines a certain amount of history, therefore the argument that orders were given and therefore you didn't have a choice doesn't excuse all of the crimes committed, not even close. As my second speaker told you, perhaps orders were given, as indeed they said, perhaps orders were given about a method of governance to impose, or how best to carry out a war. I'm pretty sure that orders weren't given that compelled you to rape thousands of people. Even if orders were given to that respect, you were under a moral obligation to not carry out those orders. My second speaker also told you that even if you weren't one of the individuals who directly contributed to these crimes, it was a clear institutional failure. There were thousands of people who supported these crimes even if they didn't directly contribute to them. There are, of course, in the shrine people who have been convicted by Tokyo tribunals, but people even who haven't are a part of a regime and served a regime that is an extreme and absolute moral harm, and therefore you have a moral obligation to not support it. This goes on to the second clash of interpretation, Mr. Speaker. Interpretation here means how is the act of a public official interpreted in this respect, and we think we win comprehensively, particularly on this clash. The opposition says we shouldn't perceive the shrine again as one mass, as just one group of people. We already told you that it's an institutional failure, therefore it's a moral wrong regardless of whether 12 people were convicted or anyone else, because we understand some people were legally liable, but everyone contributed to this regime. In addition, we told you that because there was 12 people who, for example, who committed such heinous crimes, the shrine at large is viewed as representative of an oppressive regime, both domestically and internationally. Therefore, your act as a public official in that representative capacity legitimizes the commemoration of these incidents, right? It reflects that Japan stands for that history, which is unfortunately exemplified by such atrocities. You can't change this fact immediately. What you must do is respond as well as you can to this fact, which means you must be as responsible as possible. Before I continue, go.
Assuming that the Iraqi war was a mistake, will you charge culpable generals who gave out the orders, or soldiers who not only did not follow bad orders, but were also proven not to be guilty? Why should all of them be homogenized?
So we told you, right? So for example, when countries fight wars, not all of them are war crimes, not all of them are atrocities. Only when they do extreme things, like the rape of Nanking, like the enslavement of people in sex, is it an atrocity. These people did those things, not all of them, but the regime at large represented these crimes and stood for them. You going to a shrine for this institution legitimizes that institution and is extremely irresponsible on a moral front. We also told you that when individuals, the last POI, my first speaker asked them, right? When individuals visit the shrine, they are not seen as individuals acting in a personal capacity. They're instead seen as public officials, obviously, and therefore representing the Japanese government. Therefore, particularly if these people aren't separate, and they said this, particularly if they aren't separated by who's war criminals and who's not, and the regime therefore at large is represented in the shrine, the presence of a particular public official in this respect means that you're legitimizing this stance. And here again, when they give you arguments like we remember the dead, or in the last speaker when he blatantly lies and said that the Prime Minister or the President of Japan stood there and apologized for his crimes, the opposite happened. Factually, after visiting that shrine, Abe said we should be proud of our history, we should be proud of our culture. Yes, he didn't say the rape of thousands of people is a good thing. But if he's visiting a shrine and saying history at large is a good thing, again, the connection that he built is that the shrine and the things it represents are good. We think it's extremely responsible on a moral scale. We think as a public official in particular, you have an obligation to do the opposite. We are very, very proud to propose.
Thank you, Government Whip, for this speech. And now I'd like to welcome the Opposition Whip.
Looking back on this debate, side government's debate can only work in a situation where they're able to prove that the Yasukuni Shrine has exclusive museums for war criminals. Side opposition engaged on both paradigms. So over there we already have an edge. But let's ask this question. What is the Yasukuni Shrine, and how do you resolve this factual clash? Obviously you cannot bring your specialist knowledge, this is why we will help you. Their claim was because they read the Times. We also read The Economist, and The Economist tells us, ladies and gentlemen, that Shinzo Abe was not the first prime minister to go. It's an annual event in Japan. But furthermore, let's ask us what is the more realistic setting. First of all, given the characterization of Japan, for instance, ladies and gentlemen, recently a Japanese government was forced to resign by Shinzo Abe because he tried to say the usage of comfort women was understandable. He didn't even say it was justified, but the point at which he said it was understandable, he was forced to resign, there was massive outcry. Do you really think Japanese people would be open to a shrine that said war criminals is okay? We think secondly, ladies and gentlemen, given the circumstances in Japan, where there is massive education reforms telling people as to how the Japanese government made a mistake, where there are continuous state apologies saying, ladies and gentlemen, the already existing apology, the international community saying that Japan was wrong in engaging in warfare, that Japan itself, ladies and gentlemen, by the way, it created Tokyo tribunals in order to cater to victims of war, but to punish people who engaged in warfare. Do you really think the same Japanese government would create a shrine, ladies and gentlemen, in order to commemorate war criminals? We think that's something that is not really realistic, is it? But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, is it realistic to suggest that, furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, Japan's characterization is a country which is at this moment the third largest economy in the world. It's one of the most developed societies. It has extremely free and fair media. That means it has exposure to all kinds of ideas. Do you really think, ladies and gentlemen, it is possible in a Japanese culture for you to be able to spread this message that, oh yeah, we will want to commemorate war criminals? We don't think it is realistic for you to suggest that that happens in the Yasukuni Shrine. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we also told you that it's not realistic to say that soldiers, by the way, who were not committing war crimes will not be memorialized in this particular, in this particular shrine. Obviously, ladies and gentlemen, those are the people who will be most memorialized in these shrines because people can empathize with them the most when it comes to the war. People whose grandfathers were the ones who were forced into this war, who would have been killed if they had not gone. It makes more logical reasoning to say that these are the people who would be prioritized in a war memorial, ladies and gentlemen. That doesn't make any sense to say, oh, we will just remember the war criminals and the other people can take a smaller room. Let's sit down, right? Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we think that therefore we think they've missed the boat in this debate. Their burden was to show why is it that all of these individuals, is it okay for us to brush all of these individuals as being unjust, right? So let's move on to the second issue. Even under their paradigm, right? How do you best spread the message, and what is the best form of spreading messages and ultranationalism?
So,
their argument was that they will regress into like another world war, right? How do we best reform this? Before that, go ahead.
yes, so right now what's happening is that leaders like Abe on the one hand, even if they start criticizing some of the atrocities that happened back then, end up sending a mixed message when they go to the shrine that commemorates. What do you think is the moral worth of this mixed message, which is unclear in the first place?
We think, first of all, that's a lie that this memorial does so, as we have proved in the first clash. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, given the extreme levels of high levels of narrative that already exist, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think there is any possibility of sending a mixed message when they explicitly say, ladies and gentlemen, there's no mixed message when you say, I visited this shrine so that I can regret the actions of my government. It's not a mixed message, ladies and gentlemen. Then people answer, so that's why you visited the shrine, and that's a clear message being spread out, ladies and gentlemen. When you say this in your schools, it's not a mixed message, and people understand that the purpose of this shrine is not to memorialize them, but to do other things, but to regret it, ladies and gentlemen. So moving on, right? We don't think that possibility exists, but even if it's a mixed message, that means that it dilutes all the harms you talked about, that it spreads all these messages, etc. anyway. How do we then regret? How do we then not regress, right? Number one, times have changed, right? Japan is not a country that is likely to engage in warfare really quickly. Hell, it doesn't even have an offensive military. But second, ladies and gentlemen, right, we're talking about, they said, oh, China, South Korea, all of these problems. We've seen how they've continuously tried to use peaceful methods, negotiations, etc., to solve all of these problems, etc., right? But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, ultranationalism is less likely to happen under our model when you continuously allow some public officials to go there and be able to cry in public and say how they made a mistake, how they apologize for all of their actions. That happens. That is not a factual clash, ladies and gentlemen. That is something they have to concede as well. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, and this is something we provided, never really engaged by their side, is the war memorial acts as a constant reminder that you lost an unjust war. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that essentially continuously tells people all the harmful effects of that ultranationalism to begin with. We also told you then that people are reminded of the mistakes that the government's made, but also the reminder of the costs involved of going to such ultranationalistic sentiments and of going to war. That is something that is exclusive to under our model. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think ultranationalism is best solved by victimizing 80-year-old and 90-year-old citizens of your country and their children and grandchildren, ladies and gentlemen, who are now being antagonized by the state. We don't think that's the best way to form peaceful reforms within people's minds. Then they said, but we should spread the message that you should rebel when all of that happens, and you have a moral obligation to do so. Times have changed, right? We think it already exists now. There are multiple ways in which you can engage against the government, etc. But the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, it is unfair for you to say they had a moral obligation to rebel when these people, if they had rebelled, would have been put through the death penalty. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, in status quo, we don't say the North Korean citizens should be punished for not knowing, ladies and gentlemen, that they can have a democracy, because the North Korean government has created such a media frenzy where they have no idea that there is a better dictator, or even better dictators out there than Kim Jong-un, ladies and gentlemen. We think that means that the kind of cultural brainwashing that happened on these people, even if the death penalty had not existed, which it did, we think that means they had no moral obligation to do all of those things. Which means, ladies and gentlemen, the fact is, given that all of these pressures existed, but also that all of these people, in spite of all of those pressures, a huge portion of them did not still engage in warfare and were able to hold on to their morality in spite of their pressure, means these people deserve to have that form of say. But lastly, right, even if we are to concede all of those things, why must we use 80-year-old individuals now, who back then, ladies and gentlemen, and this is something they have to concede, right? There are innocent Japanese soldiers. It's unrealistic to say otherwise. Why is it okay for us to bash these individuals in order to spread our message? We think that's wrong when you victimize these individuals who had no option but to commit those acts, who to this day, ladies and gentlemen, cannot live with themselves because of the kinds of things they had to go through. We think for their sake, we oppose.
I thank the opposition group for the speech, to conclude the case of the opposition, and let's welcome the opposition reply.
By the end of this debate, you would have realized that opposition engaged with all three characterizations: individuals who visit genuinely to commemorate war criminals, individuals who visit for their family members, individuals who visit out of regret, and also individuals who visit to commemorate victims of the Japanese regime. Because unfortunately, these victims aren't only people in China who suffered from rape. These victims are also the Japanese nationals who were coerced into a fighting force out of the policy of conscription, brainwashing, and continuous torture if they choose not to do so. These are also victims, and you need to engage with them. So let's assume the worst case scenario which they threw at us. Assuming that there are presence of war criminals, should we homogenize everyone and paint them the same brush? At least we mitigated the presence of war criminals through the Yasukuni Shrine, through our filtering mechanism, which is the Tokyo Tribunal. We posited that courts are the best arbitrator at deciding whether a person is a criminal or not. Who is their arbitrator? Government's arbitrator is their weird, ambiguous conception of moral culpability, without even showing us why that definition is the most accurate definition, in contrast to a court which is objective, which has made conviction in the past. But assuming that courts are still insufficient, we think that it is much easier for us to err on the side of caution of treating you to be innocent, in contrast to this side which automatically presumes that every single Japanese soldier, that even if they combat the system, even if they do not follow orders, and even if they do because of the coercion, automatically they are guilty. You need to err on the side of caution in contrast to presuming guilt. And we think we will win on that mitigating factor which we have provided. But then government posed us a question. But this shrine is symbolic of war criminals like the rape in Nanking. We posited that people primarily visit the shrine to respect the dead. Because keep in mind, any politicians who visit the shrine to symbolize the rape of Nanking will die. Mubarak pointed it out. The vast majority of us visit there, whether we are public official or not, is because we would like to remember our fathers and sisters who died in the war, who were coerced in the war. Why is that more likely? We give you the reason, because it's closer to our hearts. It's someone who's close to us, something which we can feel and react upon, in contrast to something which all of us will agree is insidious. But let's look on moral culpability, assuming that this becomes a big factor. We told you that it is unfair for them to use this yardstick, because who defined moral culpability back then? It wasn't the soldiers, it was the elites, the generals, and Emperor Meiji. That was an analysis which we provided, which we have yet to hear a response from. Because if you are coerced ideologically through brainwashing, through conscription, ladies and gentlemen, you need to look at the reality test. Ask yourself, realistically, can you opt out from that regime? Is it easy for you to opt out? Yes, currently we can opt out because everything has changed. But back then it was implausible for that person to opt out. But we went further. There are also people who did choose to opt out and who are still commemorated in the Yasukuni Shrine because it involves everyone. Those individuals, no matter how much torture they went through, they were persecuted under Order 112, they were hanged. Yet this side would choose to treat them as perpetrators and not victims. Even if they're in the minority, doesn't mean that you should forget the minority, ladies and gentlemen. Finally, I don't know, it's this funny argument that now I see the shrine, I'm going to commit war again. Mixed messaging will not happen because we told you, Japan has made a public apology. The education system is largely against it. The trend is against mixed messaging. The default setting is that if I go, I'm there to apologize. But assuming that mixed messaging is not enough, why would Japan go to war now? It is a developed country, it has a pacifist military. We give you a lot of reasons why Japan will not go. But assuming that this one symbol is so persuasive, the converse logic will apply. Japan realizes that it was a mistake. They lost the war. Tens and thousands of its citizens perished in that war. Why is that a symbol of success? I brought it up in my argumentation, no response from WIP. I'm waiting for them to bring it up in reply. Supremely proud to propose.
I think the opposition replied for the speech. To conclude the case of government and entire debate, as was from the government reply.
The first thing we'll try to do in our reply, Mr. Speaker, is to make sure that you don't have to adjudicate too many fact clashes. Yeah. So in order for us to do that, let's look at the sort of case that opposition has set up. It's been a partial case from the beginning, right? That if you go to the Yasukuni Shrine, fall upon there and express grief and cry and express your emotion, then it's okay. But what is the more realistic characterization that we gave you on site government? We told you that this isn't what really happens. More probably, there are mixed messages that are sent out when you go to a shrine. Even if we concede that you go there and you come out and say the histories, that are atrocities that were committed in the past are wrong, at the same time, we say you're going to a memorial that in public memory is associated with a regime that did condone such atrocities, is associated with people who did actively support 12 men maybe raping other people. We tell you that the problem with this sort of mixed messaging is that they've ignored the reality of the world we live in today. They've somehow tried to get away with the fact that Abe is a revisionist leader. Abe has at multiple times, right outside the shrine, told you to be proud of Japanese history. What is the implication then of this characterization on this event? Let's take the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario that we are in fact homogenizing people and we are in fact saying that everyone is equally culpable. We think this is a defensible stance. We say that Tokyo tribunals isn't enough of a response because that's a matter of legal culpability, as Basu told you. But on moral culpability, we say the standard is different. We told you in my speech extensively that it doesn't take one person to subjugate an entire country of people, to subjugate the whole of China and South Korea. Clearly more than one person or 12 people were involved. Secondly, we told you that your culpability is the same if you're standing by and watching your comrades rape or commit atrocities again and again and again. Let's remember this, if a majority of people had actually been opposed to this, a few good, a few bad men wouldn't have been able to do anything. But if you say that a majority of the people were in fact good men, then you had to give us proof of the fact that they weren't jingoistic nationalists during this era, that they didn't come back home with a gun hanging on their back telling you, I'm fighting a war for Japan, my son, let's be proud of this. We say that this is a more reasonable characterization to buy. Japan was an ultra-nationalist country. Japan did believe in extreme war and extreme violence, and simply the scale and the scope of the violence shows you that a lot of people must have done it. But then we told you, why is it that our message is still reasonable even if one good man in there is condemned? We told you there is a difference between a private official and a private person and a public official, something they refuse to engage with. We told you the private person may have compelling reasons because of the nature of the intimacy of his relationship with this person to ignore all of the public perception, to ignore historical implications, to ignore larger public good and to just go to the shrine and to remember his mother or his father. A public official on the other hand, we told you, is different and it's very important for him to message control. In opposition whip, they told you, in Japan, no one really believes in, everyone thinks war crimes are bad, therefore it can't possibly happen that any revisionism is possible. We say this is factually untrue, revisionism does in fact exist. Second, we say, if this were, let's just look at the unreasonability of this claim, right? If this were really true, then democratic Germany shouldn't have any neo-Nazis at all. We all know that this is untrue. There are mixed feelings. Second, even if we didn't rebut this, they rebutted this on their own by creating a contradiction. They told you that we are all too willing to excuse our ancestors because we love them, because we care for them, because we want to recognize the closeness of our relationship with them. If this is the position that you really share with this person who committed a war crime, what is the likelihood that you have that much more of an incentive to excuse what we did? We say, therefore, it's important for the public official to take a stance that the right message is created. We say the right message is not a contradictory message or a mixed message. It is a message that actively rebuts the implication of this regime, that actually contradicts and posits ourselves against this. We say that this is important, not because World War II will result as a result of not doing this, right? But because it makes people more aggressive, because it makes people think that it's okay to be ultra-nationalist and to view the moral worth of different lives differently. Let's not exaggerate, let's not trivialize the other side's claim, but we have been the more reasonable side of this debate, and for that reason we deserve to win. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor, for the speech. That concludes the debate. Please stop floor, shake hands, and wait outside for a couple of minutes.